Good morning. Good morning. My name is Darren. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thumbs up. Yes, wonderful. Anyways, I want to welcome everybody to our Schmooze and study session for Shirat Hayam. It's a pleasure to see everybody. A couple of the usual reminders, we're going to keep most people on mute when they are not asking a question or contributing to the discussion. And the other thing that I'm going to encourage people to do is to chat with each other if you'd like. You can send messages in the chat box, or you can send messages to Rabbi Gary as part of the questioning, or to me. And the last little tip that I'll suggest is that there's two options for watching. You can watch it in gallery view, where you can see all the little squares, or you can watch it in speaker view, where you'll have a larger view of the speaker. I suggest you switch to that. And then without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi Gary, who will be our speaker for today.
Thanks, everybody, and Shabbat Shalom. Today is a special Shabbat. There are several Shabbatot throughout the year that have a special designation. This one, which falls in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is known as Shabbat Shuvah. The word Shuvah means to turn or to return, because during these 10 days of repentance, we should be looking at ourselves, our lives, our actions, our habits, our values, and question whether or not they need some adjustment. And when we want to adjust something, it doesn't require that we make a 180-degree turn, but maybe it means that we need to turn slightly from what we've been doing and make a small adjustment in order to make a big difference. So this is a day of being a bit circumspect during Shabbos, and I thought it was most appropriate for us when presented by Bob Perlman and Esther Lee Stone with some ideas about what we might talk about during these High Holy Day study sessions, and the question of Black Lives Matter coming up. I thought this is a place where we as a community need to do a little shuvah and tshuva, both. Shuvah, turning, readjusting our perspective, and tshuva, some repentance. We have some culpability, which we might touch on today, but I certainly am going to touch on tomorrow night during my Yom Kippur Kol Nidre sermon. So with that in mind, I think we should begin as we always begin our study sessions, because when we talk about Torah, we talk about big Torah, as my teacher, Professor Leonard Kravitz, used to say. There's little Torah, which is the Torah that we carry around and read from, but there's big Torah, which is the corpus of Jewish learning. And because this is big Torah that we're talking about, it's still appropriate for us to say the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Eternal One, who gave us life, who gave us commandments, who made us holy through the pursuit of wrestling with the Torah. La'asok b'divrei Torah, to do the work of wrestling with Torah. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to structure this similarly to our discussion on Tuesday night, where I want to present to you a couple of thoughts that I think that are important to lift up. And then I want to engage in a discussion. I want you to ask your questions. I want you to feel comfortable challenging different points of view. That's the only way that we can really tease out the important concepts that are before us. In the packet that I sent you, if you were able to either download it or print it out, I think probably the starting point is an article or actually a fact sheet that was put together by JCPA, the Jewish Council on Public Affairs. I think it's a very helpful fact sheet, which gives you the genesis of Black Lives Matter as a movement, where it came from, what it represents. So just to understand, in many ways, parallel to Antifa, which we've been hearing about in the last couple of months from certain segments of our political leadership. Antifa is the anti-fascist community, and it's portrayed as if it were a unified organization with a leadership, a structure, and that there are elements of Antifa all over the place that are lining up and ready to do battle. Unfortunately, Black Lives Matter has been portrayed in the same way, as if it were a fully formed organization, that there was a head, that there was a structure, that there was a unified point of view, a unified platform, unified leadership. All of that is completely erroneous when understanding Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter arrives first as a hashtag on an Instagram page way back in 2013 in the wake of the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin. It was then picked up with Ferguson, and then that hashtag started to proliferate throughout the internet, the blog sphere as well. Basically lifting up the fact that in white America, one has to question whether Black Lives Matter, especially when crimes against Blacks are not treated in the same way as a similar crime against a white would be prosecuted and would be pursued. So from Black Lives Matter, from that hashtag, in fact, two different organizations, and I use the word organization rather loosely, arises. One is known as Black Lives Matter Network, and the other is the Movement for Black Lives, both of which come out of the same notion that we need to challenge the status quo ante. And basically, both the Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter movement are really an amalgam of local, not even regional, but mostly local groups of people who are fighting injustice in particular areas. So there are Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives in New York City, and then in Ferguson, St. Louis, Chicago, all around the country. And it's really simply a group of people. Now, obviously what's on everybody's mind within this group and many within the Jewish community is the seeming alignment of the Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter movement with anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Semitic positions. So I want to kind of attack that first and foremost, because I think it is on everybody's mind. In 2016, there was an attempt to put together kind of articles of importance to the members of the Black Lives Matter network. And what happened, I'm sorry, the Movement for Black Lives, 2016, what they did is they lifted up some important issues, macro issues, and then they dove down and made more specific each of those macro issues. None of those mention either Palestine or Israel, but when it comes to an area of invest and divest or divest in that original platform, along with a number of other places around the world, Israel was raised up as a place that should be divested from because of its treatment of Palestinians. And clearly within a number of Black Lives Matter local communities, there were people who were lifted up in the power structure who did hold anti-Israel, anti-Zionist points of view. We know that when we looked at the way that the Women's March was set up early on, there was a group of Jewish women who wanted to march with a rainbow flag with a Star of David in the middle of it. And there were leaders of that Women's March who refused to have any attachment to other movements aside from those which were acceptable within the women's movement. So a rainbow flag was acceptable, but the minute you put a Star of David on it, all of a sudden it became political. It evinced some support for Israel, and there were those people who figured we can't support that because look at what they're doing to the Palestinians, and Israel's a racist society. That's the trope of a number of those people within the anti-Zionist, anti-Israel community that also found their way into movement for Black Lives. So in 2016, there was what I would say parenthetical mention of Israel and Palestine. It was not one of the core principles. And again, it needs to be understood that that same document in that same section also called for divestment or cutting military expenditures from places like Somalia, Iraq, Libya, Honduras, and other places. So it wasn't specifically about Israel and Palestine. On the other hand, knowing the Jewish community as we do, there were a lot of people who took that as a reason to not be involved in any way with Black Lives Matter in any case, dismissing the entire movement, the entire leadership as anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and therefore not a place where good Jewish boys and girls ought to hang out, which is unfortunate because it meant that at the early part of the rise of the movement for Black Lives and the Black Lives Matter network, Jews really were hypercritical, stood on the sidelines for the most part, although there were Jews who were vocally proponents of this movement, of these movements. But for the most part, the Jewish community kind of stood by the sidelines. And that was taken quite seriously by the leadership of these two organizations as they were forming. A lot of those leaders were very sensitive to the fact that the Jewish community needed to be natural allies of the Black Lives Matter network and the movement for Black Lives Matter, and felt rather hurt. And that hurt quickly morphed into anger at members of the Jewish leadership because of their lack of immediate support. And it made us look duplicitous, for a lot of us, since the 1960s, when Jews were involved in the civil rights movement. To this day, we still talk about with pride the fact that Jews were the natural allies of Blacks in the civil rights movement, and will constantly lift up Cherner and Cheney and Schwerner, and the fact that there was a Black and there were two Jews who were involved in that, and Jews were marching in the South, and Jews were getting arrested as well, and we were willing to pat ourselves on the back for what we did in the 1960s. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the leadership of both the Black Lives Matter network and the movement for Black Lives Matter had every right to say, big deal. That's 40 years ago. Where are you now?
Gary, are you taking any questions in between?
I will. Yes, I will. I just want to kind of lay out where I am, and then I'm going to ask for questions and discussion. So with that in mind, there was a lot of angst between the Jewish community and the Black Lives Matter movement. But as in the recent past, a new platform was put forward, which doesn't mention Israel at all, doesn't mention Palestine at all. In fact, it has become more of an impediment even to the Black Lives Matter movement to get involved in politics outside of America. There's enough to deal with here in the United States than to take on social justice movements for people of color in Israel or anywhere else in the world. So for the most part, the current people who are involved leading Black Lives Matter Network and Movement for Black Lives are really not interested in engendering any discussion about Israel and Palestine, because there's too much junk that we have to deal with here in the United States to get waylaid by other political discussions. So you are beginning to see an opening made for the Jewish community to realign. There's one other idea that I want to lift up before I open it up, and that's the idea of intersectionality. Again, it's a problematic term which has been misused. Originally, in intersectionality, when the term was lifted up by a Columbia University professor, it was saying that because of multiple identities people have, they can feel oppressed for different reasons from different quarters. So a Black lesbian, for example, can feel oppressed because she is a lesbian, and there are people who are anti-gay, and she can also feel oppressed because she is a woman, and there are anti-feminist forces, and she could also feel oppressed because she is Black. So a Black lesbian can now feel the pressure from three different areas, and that's intersectionality, that these three areas intersect in order for a person to feel oppressed. And it's from different quarters or different corners that one can feel oppressed. The problem was that the term intersectionality, which was a term of art in order to tease out where these feelings of oppression come from, was used by a number of people to say, if you don't feel oppressed in this area because you're oppressed from this area, you don't count. Because if you don't feel as a Jew, you can feel that you're oppressed as a Jew because there are anti-Zionist or anti-Israel or anti-Semitic forces out there. But if you can't buy into the fact that there are Palestinians who are also upset about something, then you're not part of our movement. You now, if you can't buy into all areas of intersectionality that affect you and people around you, then you don't count. And it was used as a term to kind of cleave people away from the center of leadership. And again, it was a misrepresentation of what intersectionality was coined to point out. So it leaves us with a lot of issues. Where do we in the Jewish community fit within this movement for Black Lives or the Black Lives Matter network? Where do we stand with people who are expressing racism? What are our natural partners? And how do we step up? How do we look at the fact that by being on the sidelines, we are no longer players, and we cannot rely on the history of what we did in the past, in the 1960s, in order to say, we're cool, we're good, we've done enough. We haven't done enough. The reality is the existence of Blacks in America is a situation that we desperately need to address. And until we address it, we may not be being honest to ourselves, honest about ourselves, and honest about how we do fit into this. Because if you have a culture that can continue to justify the oppression of Blacks, how much different is that from a culture that can justify the oppression of Jews because of who we are? So with that kind of introduction, I now do want to engender discussion and questions. So I'm going to switch to kind of a gallery view, and I'm going to ask Darren if he would moderate from here.
Sure. So if someone has something that they want to speak or ask a question, if you can send a chat to me in the box, that's one way. If you lift your hand, and I see Harry's already done that, that's another good way. And I'm going to pass it over to Harry for the first question.
Thanks, Darren. So Gary, I know you started by saying that Black Lives Matter originally started as a loosely based hashtag after George Zimmerman was killed. So my question, and maybe I missed that during your presentation, is there a quote unquote central leadership now that speaks for the movement?
No, there is not. And in fact, it is problematic on a number of levels, although it keeps it as it was formed as a grassroots organization, and among the people who are potential leaders, or at least people who are vocal spokespeople for Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black Lives, they are not interested in establishing an organization. They are more interested in dealing with the issues in the grassroots, because in point of fact, you need to deal with it community by community, and each community is organic. So what's going on in Louisville, to deal with what's going on in Louisville right now is of little moment to people in Chicago in terms of the technique or what the issues are. Chicago has its own issues, and Chicago has a lot of issues. New York has its own issues. So it was formed as a grassroots movement, a loose amalgam, and it remains that way to this day. And what is problematic about it is that there are people who want to make contributions, who want to be, financially supportive of Black Lives Matter. There's no central agency, so they have no way of distributing funds appropriately. There is no 501c3, not-for-profit status for Black Lives Matter. So it is their detriment, but right now there is no organization.
All right, so with that in mind, as you mentioned earlier, if there are people who are part of Black Lives Matter and also try to promote BDS, there's no central organization that speaks out against that.
Except for the fact that there are people within the community who speak out against it, and the people who are vocal about BDS and others are a small percentage of the people who are involved in Black Lives Matter. That they have a platform, that they use it, we're going to have that's out there. There are BDS movements on college campuses supported by white students. So, BDS is not, it's not a Black Lives Matter issue. It's across the board. So if we want to fight BDS, we fight BDS, and we attack it on every level that we can. But BDS is not a tenant of Black Lives Matter. And in fact, as I said, in 2016, it was a tangential point in a larger platform. And in 2020, in the new platform, it's completely absent. It's not there.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions right now? I don't see anything. Oh, sorry, I do. I see Susan waving wildly, so I will use her and spotlight her.
Hopefully not that wildly. No, so who makes up these platforms then? If there's no central structure, then
representative spokespeople from the individual grassroots movements. It would be like if a group of congregants from Shirat HaYam got together and wrote, what our basic principles were, unless somebody came along and said, no, this does not represent us, it's out there. And, yeah, okay, fine. This is what we represent. And that's what it is. There's no, it's not official, as it were. On the other hand, a group of intellectuals within the various grassroots movements decided to kind of articulate what they thought were their binding principles. So it was done in 2016, and what existed in 2016 was no longer satisfactory, and so it was rewritten and redone in 2020, this year. And as I said, it went from, and this is a natural progression in organizations. When an organization starts, it has these wild beliefs that it can change the entire universe. So everything and anything is thrown into the hopper. In the intervening 4 years from 2016 to now, it became obvious that there's so much stuff out there. If we become amorphous and try to attack everything, we'll have no power. Let's concentrate on what's going on in each of the communities. And so therefore the 2020 platform really drills down to what is necessary to attack racism here in the United States in our individual communities. And nobody has really objected to the platform as it was circulated. But there was no what I would call a ratification process. When Moses comes down the mountain, it says in the Torah, he tells the people, in Kedoshim, which follows the issuing of the Ten Commandments, what the laws are all about. And it says he read, the technical Hebrew is, he read it into the ears of the people and they agreed. In Hebrew, he read it into their ears is in fact what is called a ratification process. Ratification process where it is presented as a whole and everybody has to buy in. There is no ratification process of this platform with Black Lives Matter. It's not like everybody, signed on to it. It simply was put out there as one of the core principles that we're dealing with now as grassroots organizers that eschew a national organization. They don't want to imitate all the other organizations that are out there. They feel it's far more important to be organic in the communities. So they put this out there and everybody says, oh, okay, yeah. We don't disagree with it. It kind of sums up where we're at. And this is the platform. But it's not ratified.
I see Nina has a question, and so I'm going to ask her to unmute and then hand it over to her.
Okay, so I don't think that we were aware really. I think I had a sense of it that this is a very disorganized movement in a way. And I think I understand the two platforms, let's say, but it would be far better if they somehow could merge with chapters in the various communities that have specific issues. If a leader would come forward to be, you said that they don't really have a leader,
right?
And
they don't.
Self-defeating in a way, because as there are a lot of people who just go along with and believe in Black Lives Matter, but they're not aware of all this activity behind the scenes.
I think on the one hand, Nina, I understand what you're saying. On the other hand, forgive me for saying, and I beg your forgiveness for saying it. It sounds paternalistic for us, and we could call it maternalistic. I don't care, since it came from your mouth, I will say maternalistic, Nina. But for us to impose a structure on them, for us to tell them how to run their organization, for us to say, wouldn't it be better if you did A, B, and C? Again, we really need to be very careful of that. because this is an organic reaction to the reality that blacks feel, that black people feel in their community on a day-by-day basis. And the fear is if they spend time creating a national organization, that they will get farther away from what needs to be dealt with. What needs to be dealt with is where black people fit into the community in which they live. So as I say, the challenges for black people in New York is different than in Chicago or in Louisville or in St. Louis or in Miami or in LA. And if you have a group of people who are going to spend their time creating a national organization and national structures, you're no longer dealing with the facts on the ground. And for them, this is a day by day, hour by hour problem. And they want to deal with the problem right now. You know, the question of, for example, defunding the police, which again has been completely misconstrued and misused. It's not defunding the police, but it is taking funds and putting it into community services that will allow policing and protection and communities to feel safer. And sometimes it's not by adding more people with guns and badges. Maybe it's more social workers, and maybe it's more health professionals in the community, and maybe it's more community organizers, or maybe it's more food banks, whatever it is. That funding, in order to bring down the level of tension, is not about removing police officers, but it is about creating a safer community. And it is going to change from one community to another. You know, there are certainly issues here on the island of Nantucket. We still have not found and charged the people who attacked the African Meeting House. And I mean, that's a shanda. But we don't need a national organization to tell us that. That's something here that a grassroots community needs to continue to advocate for and to speak out about. I don't need somebody from Chicago to tell us that we have a problem here on Nantucket. We have a problem here on Nantucket, and it needs to be addressed if it's going to help protect the people of color on this island. So therefore, they have pushed back on what they would call, you know, a patriarchal or matriarchal vision of what they should do. We don't have a right to tell them what they should do. We don't have a right to say, wouldn't it be better if? This is the way they choose to lead their community, because they want to speak to the people that are right in their faces. And they recognize that every community is going to require a different kind of fix in order to make things better. And once they get their community act together, maybe down the road, when they feel that they really have learned some things and they have made some changes, they can have a wider vision. But it was clear in the beginning, the notion of, if we have a wide vision, and we're talking about Palestinians, and we're talking about what's going on in Mali, and we're talking about what's going on in Somalia, and all sorts of stuff like that, we're not dealing with what's going on the streets next door. And so I, you know, from what I understand, this is a choice that they've made to maintain this as a grassroots movement without a singular spokesperson who can, in fact, become a target. You know, you lift up one person as the head of Black Lives Matter, then, you know, everybody who's opposed to Black Lives Matter will spend their time attacking that person and trying to bring down the organization. It's a lot harder to bring down an organization that you can't point the finger of who's the head of.
All right. They do support each other, though, because look, they marched in protest immediately in Louisville, but they're also marching in, whether you call it in support or sympathy, but they're marching in Chicago, and they're protesting they're joining in that sense, right? Yeah. The other towns, the other cities are joining in protest together with the protest in Louisville.
Yes, there's no question that people say, if I've got bandwidth, as it were, and I have the financial ability and the freedom to move around, yes, we can go and support what's going on to deal with an immediate issue. So clearly, people descended upon Louisville because Louisville is right now a pregnant issue in the community. It's in the public's eye. There is an absolute injustice that was brought about by not charging any of the officers with a crime against based upon the murder of Breonna Taylor. And in fact, made worse by the fact that the police officer who was actually responsible for firing some of those shots then sent out a public letter to all of his fellow police officers saying, boys and girls, we have to get strong. We have to go back out there on the streets. And, I mean, that was it's an affront on every level. So yes, there are people who have the freedom of movement that can go and be supportive. But then they can go, if something were to happen, you know, in Dallas tomorrow, maybe they'll be able to go there. But it's not done as an organized basis. It's done as a group of individuals who have the bandwidth, who can be supportive to a local community. But it ultimately is the local community that is in charge of doing the protesting, that is protesting what has happened in their own neighborhood.
But there is a connection.
Well, yeah, there's a connection because they care. You know, there are people who care about it.
Right.
But it's not, as I said, there's no central organization that calls up the troops and say, okay, everybody from this area, please go to that area right now. It's not coordinated in that way. It's simply individuals who go to be supportive, who, because they have the ability, they have the freedom to be able to move about. I'm going to go to Louisville. I'm going to stand with my brothers and sisters there. But it's not like there was a general call put out and you know, a chapter from this community goes to a chapter to that community.
Rabbi,
Well,
I have a question coming from Harry. If Nina, if you, I don't want to stop you short, but if we'll move on. Great. Sorry, so I'm going to do Harry, and then I see Esteli also waving. So Harry, go ahead.
Okay, Gary. Hi. So just getting back to the subject, which is why does Black Lives Matter to Jewish people? I doubt that hardly anybody, I would hope hardly any Jew would question why we would want to support trying to reverse the injustice that's done to Black people. But with that in mind, and we talked about the centrality of Black Lives Matter, there's really no centrality when it comes to the voice of the Jewish people as well.
Correct. That is absolutely true. On the other hand, first and foremost, what has happened to the Black community also happens to Black Jewish people. And there happen to be Black Jewish people, Black people who are Jews. And they come to that either through transracial adoption. We know a lot of congregants, we know a lot of Jewish families who adopt a child of color and introduce them into the Jewish community. We also have people who are immigrants from Africa and other places where people of color come from. We also have people who convert to Judaism from the Black community. So there is an intersection here for members of our community as well. There are Black Jews who are oppressed by the racial oppression that is extant in white America. But at the same time, that license to treat Blacks the way white America has treated Blacks for these 400 years. And while, yes, there have been advances since the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, there is still racism, structural racism, habitual racism here in white America that has still not been addressed. The fact of the matter is we Jews feel very comfortable here in America for the most part. but there is still anti-Semitism. It is still rife. And if we want to bring the justice in balance, we need to be able to say that what is happening to the Black community is happening to us, not just because we share this "we are the world" attitude, but it viscerally, that this is injustice against Blacks hurts who we are as Jews. And again, I saw in the chat box from Sue, is there a conference of American Jewish organizations? Well, a number of organizations within the Jewish community have gotten behind the notion of supporting Black Lives Matter. In your packet, towards the back, I'm trying to remember where I put it, but it is towards the back. There was a full-page New York Times ad that in the middle of the ad was Black Lives Matter and to Jews, and 600 Jewish organizations supported that ad and signed on. And that is everybody from the Union for Reform Judaism, the Conference of Presidents of American Jewish Organizations, Anti-Defamation League, B'nai B'rith. Yeah, there you go. We speak with one voice when we say unequivocally Black Lives Matter. And, the whole page was surrounded by organizations. So, yeah, there are Jewish communities out there. But again, it is clear that the Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives have chosen to eschew a national hierarchy. And so we need to be supportive of that and be supportive the way that they want to fight racism. And they want to fight racism on the ground, incident by incident, neighborhood by neighborhood, place by place. And we Jews need to step up. It's not enough. Frankly, it's lovely that we put an ad in there, but we Jews need to, because we do have, in some cases, some of us, the financial freedom, the bandwidth, the political freedom to go and stand shoulder to shoulder. We need to be doing that. We need to be visible. And one other point, going back to the whole BDS movement and going back to the Jewish discussion of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and all of that. One of my colleagues and dear friend, Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, who's the senior rabbi of Central Synagogue in New York, is a woman of color, is a convert to Judaism, and was very, very upset originally in 2016 about the fact in the platform that there was any mention of BDS or anti-Zionism or the Israeli oppression against Palestinian, and for that matter had removed herself from the table. And then she realized, but if I'm not at the table, I can't raise these issues. I can't talk about this if I'm not at the table. Because if I'm not at the table, they have every right to shut the door in my face. They say you're not a player. And she decided that the only way she could participate was by getting at the table, by becoming part of the community, by standing side by side and saying, we're here to fight with you because it's as important to us as it is to you. And by the way, there are issues that perturb us. Can we talk about it? Can we put those on the table? And she was very successful in being able to articulate that this issue of BDS or this issue of anti-Zionism or this issue of being pro-Palestinian was only taking our attention away from what's really, really important at the moment.
Rabbi, I'm going to pass over to Esteli, who I know has been waiting patiently. If you take the unmute.
Gary, I would like to talk a little bit about structural racism, and I'd like to talk about the Nantucket community. We thus far have not mentioned what it must be like to be a Black person in the Nantucket community. white world and the black world seem to me to be very separate, very separate. There are very few black tourists. There are very few individuals who are black who are involved in the government. There are very few individuals who are involved in any of the organizations. And it just seems to me that there are two totally separate worlds. I'm not sure if there is violence other than that, where the anyway, I think you know what I'm talking. There was one, as far as I know, there was just one violent act in the community, although I may be ignorant of others. But we seem not to be able to talk about our own community, what the problems are, and what we can do about it. And in addition to not being able to talk about, we are a seasonal community. There are very few full-time people here. So dealing with this problem has even more difficulties. But it is something that I have noticed for a number of years, how separate the two worlds are, financially, organizationally, spiritually. And I'd like if anybody has any comments about it.
No, first of all, I feel that, and I'm in complete agreement with you. For the one intersection, as it were, where blacks and whites do come together, or people of color and whites do come together on this island, is within the school system, within the schools. And I know a couple of years ago when the attack occurred on the African Meeting House, and there were several anti-Semitic incidents that occurred, where there was graffiti on I believe the side wall of a house of a person who had a Jewish sounding name. I don't even know if they were part of the Jewish community, where I remember going with leaders of our community to meet with Chief Pittman and also Jim Perlman to talk about what we could do. There was an offer made to them that the congregation would be willing to be supportive financially of bringing in organizations that were expert in lessening tension, racial tension, and prejudicial attitudes. The offer was, appreciated but not taken up. I do think that our congregation, we are proud of the fact that the congregation has been supportive of the Nantucket Food Pantry through our work with the Interfaith Council. Thank you, Susie and Susan, for continuing to so well represent us in that. But I'm not sure that the wider Shirat Hayam community is aware of our support for the food pantry. I'm not so sure that the wider community of Shirat Hayam is even aware that there's a need for a food pantry here. And you're absolutely right, Esteli, to talk about a bifurcation of communal segments here on the island. It's very, very visible. There are not too many people of color who are homeowners of places. There are not people of color who choose Nantucket as a destination for tourism. There are not many visible Black-owned businesses on the island. For the most part, people of color make up the service community, and therefore there is an economic and a racial stratification here that exists on this island. I think that we do have an obligation to talk about it. I think we have an obligation to do something about it. I'm proud of our partnership with Linda Simmons and the UU Church, because they are and have been for a long time a religious community that works on island all year round. And Linda has made many interesting established relationships with the religious people of color on this island. When we did the interfaith service, I will tell you a very interesting side story. I'm not sure most of you know it, but in May, Linda and I, and we have a lovely friendship and a wonderful relationship, and we often get together and have lunch together, and we also talk about spiritual issues and all sorts of stuff like that, offline. We were talking, and I said, we really need to have kind of an interfaith response to COVID and interfaith response to the illness and death that we're all experiencing. And that was the seed that germinated into the interfaith service that we put together and was broadcast. And we discovered that the two interfaith events, the interfaith message that we got together to do around Passover and Easter, and the interfaith service that was broadcast a number of times, are the two highest rated programs on NCTV 18, which is an interesting fact that Darren and I just learned yesterday when we were doing our tech rehearsal with Frank from NCTV. But what was interesting was when we were putting together this interfaith service, I said to Linda, allow me to draft an invitation to all of the other ministers and faith community heads to invite them to participate. Because originally it was put together really by Linda and me, and then Max from the Episcopal Church also joined in. And so we sent out a letter, and innocently, I asked, I wanted everybody's participation, but I asked at the end in the final paragraph, should they choose to be involved, could they make room in their words to be inclusive rather than exclusive? Meaning, if you pray in the name of our Lord and Savior, then you are excluding those people who don't buy into that. And I was asking people, could they lift up a text or a prayer that was meaningful? Could they share some religious insight? But could they accommodate a wider community without excluding them through their language? And Linda called me a couple of days later and said, you know what? I heard from Father Bloise, who is actually, he's the one who's lending us the television monitor that we're using in the sanctuary. And in fact, the reading stand that now has the Shirat Hayam crest on it is actually from their church. And we asked if they could use it, and they said yes, without charge. But Father Bloise said, I can't participate in anything where I can't speak in the name of my Lord and Savior. And Linda said she felt we needed to reconsider that. We needed to think about what we were asking of him. And I immediately picked up the phone and I said, I apologize for what I thought was a welcome invitation, but in fact actually excluded you. I would like you to participate and feel free to speak in any way that is natural to you. Why I'm lifting this up is I want us to understand that we need to be able to meet the people of color on this island in their place. They exist, they're here. I think as a community, we need to make a better effort to do that, because in this grassroots area, we have issues that we need to work on. And unless we work on them here, we really don't have a right to talk about what's going on anywhere else.
Rabbi, I know there was a comment, sorry, because I do have an order. I think Harry had something he wanted to say, and then I see Nina. So I'm going to call on Harry first, and then Nina.
Yeah, it's just to follow up on what Esteli just talked about. I'm not saying that we shouldn't make an effort to do more than what we've already done, but don't forget, after the incident at the African Meeting House, we decided to have a service at the African Meeting House, and we invited the African American community to come, and nobody came. Now, I'm not sure that their leadership knew, that their leadership told them about it, and maybe that's why they didn't come. But they were invited and they didn't show up. It's not to say we shouldn't do more going forward after COVID. We should definitely try to have more events where we invite people of color to come. But I wanted to remind you of that.
And Harry, I understand that. But again, and the gesture and the intent was right. But again, try, if possible, to put yourself in their shoes. This is the first time we made that offer. The first time we made obviously it was provoked by a very sad moment in the history of the island. But you don't create a relationship simply by inviting somebody to something and not continuing to pursue that. And I think we did it once and didn't do much after that. So I'm being critical of our work. Just because we put it out there and nobody came, you want to build a relationship with somebody. Sometimes you have to put an effort into it. If you want to meet somebody, if you want them to be your friend, just by inviting them over for a drink doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to establish a meaningful relationship. So I think we have to work at it a bit harder than we've done. So I think that's a challenge for all of us. I agree that we were right in making that offer, in envisioning it, but sometimes our level of expectation of how somebody's going to react is a bit skewed.
Well, the only reason I bring it up, just to follow up on what Esteli is saying, she's absolutely correct. There's a divisiveness here. It's driven mostly by economics, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And we have to continue going forward. We should have at least one event every year where we invite people of color, not just African Americans, because we probably have a lot more Latinos here than we have African Americans. But we have to try to figure out a way to do that.
Well, we have to ask them. We have to ask them. We have to make our interest known, and we have to ask them what will help.
Yes. And again, the idea that we create a program, we create a way of addressing an issue and then invite them to it is very different than what Esteli just said. We didn't say, what would be helpful to you? We said, here's the problem. We're going to move our services there. We've created an idea that this is going to be a representation. This is going to be wonderful. And we want you to come. But that wasn't necessarily what they may have wanted. And we need to, again, our default is to act paternalistically or maternalistically or whatever you want to call it, is to decide what the appropriate response is and then do it. And then we act surprised when people don't resonate with that. I think that we need to have a whole different idea about, and that's why going back to Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, that it is a grassroots organization, that it is addressing the issue on the ground and not looking for global perspectives or global solutions. It's trying to address that matter. We need to do the same thing. We need to open up opportunities to ask and to be invited into their community in order to address their issues. Not to come up with an idea and figure, since they didn't show up, they're not interested. It's just maybe they weren't interested in the solution we were offering, or maybe they didn't know about it.
Rabbi, two things I want to, because I know we're mindful of time. I know Nina wants to ask a question. I think she should do that. And I know that you wanted to move to the prayers. Yeah. Let's first ask Nina to unmute and let her ask her question.
not really a question, but many of you know that I have a personal connection, let's call it, in this whole issue with Michael, who's living with me. And you know him, and he's Black, and he's from New York City, born in this country. And it's given me a new perspective and a more of an understanding, partly with just conversations with him. To Esther Lee's question, yes, there is a divide. He has a circle of friends that are, I'm sure, perhaps there's a small group because of COVID, but they get together several times a week and they have dinner together or they go to a restaurant. And that's that's just a Black group, and they don't necessarily mingle with the general population here. So that's an answer to that, and why, you know, I've invited him, and on occasion he's come. As a matter of fact, he came with me to some, I don't know whether it was some service that a couple of years ago, he came with me to some service that was an interfaith service of some kind.
No, I think it was when we invited my colleague from the Boston ADL office, and we did it at the African Meeting House. And I remember Michael being there.
At the Unitarian Church.
I think it might have been, it wasn't a Martin Luther King.
Yes, that must have been it.
Right, then that was not what I was saying.
But generally he doesn't like to, want to mingle with my group. Let's call it my group if I'm doing something. He'll take me there, but he doesn't join. But his perspective here is that he's comfortable here. He doesn't have the fear that he lived with every single day in New York. He feels that he can get out in his car and drive, and the policemen are not going to stop him for no reason at all. And he has his 3 daughters here. They spent the summer with me here, and now because their schooling is only virtual, they're doing it here. And he feels he's getting them into a better place where they can perhaps get out of the Black community, such as it is where he says that there are, hundreds of people living in an apartment house. One of the girls worked here all summer, is still working, I think, today at the bakery. In New York, the kids, there aren't enough jobs, so they don't have that experience. And they end up, because the easiest way to have money is to get into the drug world. So he's unusual, there's no question, but he sees a difference. He's much more comfortable here than he is in New York City. He says, you don't know what it's like to grow up being fearful as soon as you step out the door. He hasn't experienced, that he's told me, other than one incident, which I was privy to. I didn't hear it directly, but we walked into the dining room here one day, a long time, quite a while ago, and he overheard one of the residents whisper something like, "Oh, look at Nina, she's bringing," kind of saying, the help to dinner with her. So that, I'm sure he meets that occasionally, but generally he's a lot happier here. And I'm happy to have him.
And he's delightful. I enjoy him very much.
Yeah, he enjoyed you. He says you're his favorite rabbi.
I'm sure that there's a huge list of people on that, a list of rabbis on that list.
He doesn't tell me everything, but occasionally we'll have a discussion. And he says, you don't know what it's like. And he's hopeful, and yet very skeptical, because all the promises in the politics that you get, and then nothing ever happens. He says, maybe this time it'll be different if the right person gets into office.
So I know that we're actually over by a couple of minutes, and I did want to end with something. Bob Perlman shared a lovely piece of a prayer, a different version of I think it's the Al Chait. No, it's not Al Chait. It's Darren.
Unataka Tokef.
Right, Unatana Tokef. Right, and it it is much better to see it rather than to read it if you didn't have it, because the way it's structured is really quite powerful. So I thought that we would read it, and it begins the third paragraph down. Each day we hazard our black lives in the court of the white world. We know our worth, yet the white world is judge, self-appointed. We pass before you to be counted. 12.5 million bodies stolen. 1.8 million mercifully avoided your shores. Stolen land. 10.7 million arrived unsafely, times 104 years, times infinite human indignities, times 3/5 of a human being. We now number 47.8 million. In the morning it is written, and by curfew it is sealed. Who shall die by jogging? And you can see the names of the people for whom this actually represents. Who shall die while relaxing in the comfort of their home? Who shall die while seeking help after a car crash? Who shall die while holding a cell phone? Who shall die while decorating for a party? Who shall die while leaving a party? Who shall die while enjoying music? Who shall die while selling music, trying to make a way out of no way? Who shall die while sleeping? Who shall die while worshiping the Lord? Who shall die for a traffic violation? Who shall die while coming from the store? Who shall die while playing cops and robbers? Who shall die while lawfully carrying a weapon? Who shall die while on the shoulder of the road with car problems? Who shall die in the first hours of the new year? Who shall die while shopping at Walmart? Who shall die while cashing a check in peace? Who shall die while reading a book in their own car? Who shall die while taking a walk with their stepfather? Who shall die while reaching for their wallet? Who shall die while walking away? Who shall die while asking a cop a question? Who shall die while begging for their life, their breath? Who shall die by the effects of supremacy, greed, and apathy? Who by beast and deed? But repentance, prayer, and charity temper judgment's severe decree. But repentance, prayer, and charity avert judgment's severe decree. But turning, connection, and giving, these return us to our God. Whose repentance? Whose prayer? Whose charity? Temper, please temper. Temper already, temper. For the sins against God, the Day of Atonement brings forgiveness. For the sins against one's fellow man, the Day of Atonement brings no forgiveness till he has been reconciled with the fellow man he wronged. The Day of Atonement brings no forgiveness till he has become reconciled with the fellow man he wronged. When will you atone? How will you atone? For you, like us, will be judged. You, like us, will return to dust. Thank you all for being here together. Shabbat Shalom. And most importantly, Gamar Chatima Tova. May we end this season of renewal and turning with our names entered into the book of life for blessing. Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and thanks.
Yashar Koach, Gary.
Thank you.